A Suffolk sunset. Little to do with Alderney's occupation, you might think, but it's here in this graveyard that the best memories lie buried. Between 1939 and 1946, just one family lived through the island's lost years. In 1940, Alderney was under the same threat of German invasion as the rest of the islands. By the 18th of June, some of its residents had already been evacuated aboard a Trinity Lighthouse ship. But then, as occupation became inevitable, the island's leader, Judge French, called an island-wide meeting. That day, the 23rd of June, the islanders left, leaving only a handful behind.
I went out with letters because I had relatives in England and I wanted to tell them I was staying behind. And I ran out to give letters to people, and I had to run because the people were running. I just had to run beside them and put the letters into their hands. And lots of them hadn't even got suitcases. And those that had, some of them dropped them, and they didn't stop to pick them up. They just ran. I've never seen anything like it.
Daphne Pope was waiting for her husband George, but his boat, the Wishbone, had been sunk off St Malo. Just days after Alderney's evacuation, sheer coincidence would reunite them in Guernsey as the Germans bombed the White Rock. She was pregnant and he escaping from Jersey's harbour. This house in Alderney, however, was home, and the family couldn't afford to stay in Guernsey. So a month later, along with a handful of others, they came back with the German troops, Mrs Pope's mother, and 4 children. The eldest of these was Rosemary. By then she was 5, and she and her brother Michael grew up in St Anne's, a town now populated by Germans.
I thought that was the normal life, to look out of a window and see soldiers marching past. Seemed natural. It was all I was used to. Now, of course, it's just as natural to see cars, but if I'd seen a car, I'd have been horror-stricken.
We spent 5 years, I suppose, from 39 until, well, just over, because we didn't leave until the beginning of 1946. Good memories, and some of them were pretty horrible. I'd rather forget some of them. In a sense, it was absolutely normal, where the children were concerned. I mean, there were still nappies to wash and things to do, but in other ways, it was very strange indeed. For one thing, I couldn't go shopping. The Germans owned everything in the shops, everything in all the houses. I wasn't under house arrest. I could walk around. I could go into gardens, I could go into fields to start with, but I wasn't allowed to go into any building whatsoever.
But did you get on with the Germans well?
Well, it depends on which German you mean. Some of them were swine and some of them were tolerable, and some of them were quite good. But all I do know is that I'm glad that house had a good many doors, because we used to get people into that house that we didn't always want Germans to see, and we were also taking things into the house we didn't want them to see. They brought in a lot of French people. They were digging, I remember, in a field just opposite our house. So they used to come across in the evening, and if the coast was clear, they'd come into the hall, go straight into the kitchen, and Mother ran a sort of little unofficial soup kitchen there.
It wasn't all bad. I mean, at Christmas time, the only thing we did think was odd was that instead of coming to the front door, which was what the men did who searched, other Germans would climb over our back garden wall at Christmas time, and they would bring us sweets. And they'd show us photographs of their children and say, "We haven't seen our children for some years because we are in this war."
You actually made good friends with some of the German soldiers, didn't you?
I remember Wilhelm. He was a very nice chap, and I may say he was not a Nazi. He came to the door to ask if I would do his washing, and I told him no. Of course, I told him politely. I got a few words of German. I said, "I've got children, I've much work to do," and all the rest of it. He said, "That's a pity, because I brought you a loaf of bread." But he said, "Even if you don't want the washing, I'm not going to take the bread back, because I've got plenty of bread to spare." I thought, well, here's a sensible chap, and I can do with bread. So I said, well, I'll do it for 1 week. I did it for the 1 week. And he brought me another loaf of bread, and he brought me cigarettes, and I thought, this is all right.
Occupation meant doing what you were told. It was also about surviving. A garrison town and an island cut off by war was not an easy place to live. Food was short.
My father stole some fish from a store. You know, he took a terrible risk. And we sort of survived on these fish. And all I can remember these damned things, they were tiny fish and they were stiff with salt. And we tried to wash the salt out of them, but they were practically inedible. But we did eat them, because you do if you're really, really hungry.
There was one man, and he was the Air Force Commandant, a very tough little man. And he looked at George and he said, "Of course you can go fishing." He said, "And I do not send a guard with you. These are your guards." And he pointed to me and the children.
George Pope was left to fish and to pilot the Germans to the nearby Casquets Rocks. But in 1942, a daring British raid on the lighthouse almost cost him his life. The British forces succeeded in capturing the 7 Germans who manned it, but back at base, suspicion fell on Pope's shoulders.
They suspected that he must have been in league somehow. So it's a bit ironic. The Germans thought my father was sending secret messages to the opposition. And then the islanders thought my father was a spy. So you've got both sides looking at my father with suspicious eyes. But real life isn't always like that.
It was like walking a tightrope, because you could never trust anybody completely, and yet there were decent Germans amongst them, but you had to grab any opportunity for getting food or whatever when it offered, and never be found taking things in the wrong way from their point of view, which made it difficult.
By 1942, Alderney had been repopulated, but not by those islanders who'd been evacuated to Britain. Instead, the island was being made over in Hitler's image. Alderney became the heart of Hitler's Atlantic Wall defences, exporting granite to other parts of Europe and transforming itself into a fortress island. To do this, it imported labour from France, Russia and much further afield. Many of their graves lie here at Longy Common.
I saw this funny man, whether he was a Moroccan or whatever he was. My father, as a seaman in his early years, had kicked around the world, and he could speak a little Arabic. And he addressed this man in Arabic, and he couldn't believe it.
4,000 prisoners of war were brought here in 1942 by the organisation Todt to build the fortifications which dominate to this day. They were kept in 4 camps around the island, some in better condition than others. Of the island's labouring camps, the most notorious was the Lager Sylt. It was run by the SS until 1944, when it was shut down, because as the fortunes of war changed, so the Nazis tried to cover up their atrocities. There's no memorial here, the only camp in Europe of its type not to have one across the whole of Nazi-dominated Europe. But when you think that potentially hundreds of people died in this camp between 1942 and 1944, then Alderney can truly be said to have been the Isle of the Dead. Workers were expendable. The first arrived here from Sachsenhausen, their human rights and their dignity already taken away.
We felt so sorry to see them all go past, and even as a child it made an impression on me. I thought, oh, poor people, what have they done? And I sometimes think, did any of them ever survive?
Sylt camp was a sub-camp of Neuengamme. It was a proper sub-camp. It was staffed by Neuengamme staff. The atrocities carried out in Sylt were absolutely appalling. And I find it quite remarkable that the story is not better known. Certainly there's a case for a proper memorial to Sylt camp on the site.
It's hard to imagine the conditions these slave labourers had to endure, and helping them was not an option.
I can remember my granny running out with a bowl of soup and trying to give it to one of these poor men who was starving, and being frog-marched back into the house by a German who fortunately knew us. I think my mother had done washing for him, and he apparently said to my mother, "I should have shot her. Keep her under control. Don't ever let her do that again."
At the end of the war, British military investigations estimated that hundreds had died here, but claims by George Pope that many more prisoners had been thrown to their deaths from the breakwater were rubbished.
Well, George Pope was a bit of an enigma, and he was really badly treated by history, I'm afraid. George Pope was one of the few who provided testimony to the British investigating forces at the end of the war, and he provided very detailed testimony. The testimony subsequently was discredited, and unfairly discredited. There seemed to be a mechanism to try and diminish the suffering that the inmates had experienced in Alderney, and George Pope's testimony didn't really fit with this objective, and therefore his testimony was unnecessarily and inaccurately criticised. Later examination reveals that much of what George Pope said actually happened. When he talked about bodies being thrown off the Alderney breakwater, it was witnessed by literally dozens of other inmates.
But slave labourers weren't the only ones affected. When the Germans refused medical help to Daphne Pope's infant son Anthony, he died.
There was a feeling in the island from every civilian of absolute loathing for the Germans. The Guernseymen, I remember, being very kind, and they came to me and they said, "We will not have any Germans who were responsible for your son's death have anything to do with the arrangements for his funeral." They did everything, except one thing. I did that. I did the laying out of the child. But they made the coffin and they dug the grave. There was only one thing that I did want, and that meant I had to ask a German. I wanted a priest for the actual funeral service. I always remember that as they carried the coffin along Victoria Street, all the curtains were drawn of all the houses where the Germans were billeted, and there was no sound. And I have to say for that priest, he was a brave man, because you see, he didn't come in looking like a priest in vestments. He was in full German uniform. And he walked into the churchyard, and there stood all the Guernseymen and some of the French, and he went through every word of it in Latin. And that held them. And afterwards, when they had lowered the coffin down, he did a full military salute over the grave. And that's when I held my breath for him, because you see, the military salute was the Nazi salute. I've been looking for the wooden cross that was put over Anthony's grave, but I haven't found it. And in a way, I'm glad I haven't seen it. Too many memories, and some perhaps are best forgotten.
HMS Rodney, gallant veteran of many campaigns, goes out to bombard the German-held Channel Island of Alderney. Our convoys crossing to Cherbourg might be menaced by enemy guns on the island, so Rodney's job is to silence those guns. The gun crews are ready, the target has come within range, and the signal is given to fire. And just ahead is the Cherbourg Peninsula. Rodney's 16-inch guns are firing right over it to the German-held island about 17 miles away.
I do remember when the battleship Rodney shelled Alderney for about 2 hours. And it's the only time I've seen my mother frightened. She was a tough lady. And I can never forget, she was trying to do my little coat up, and I was standing against the hall wall, and it suddenly moved back and then back again. And it was such a peculiar sensation. And then we sort of ran for dear life and squeezed into one of the Germans' air shelters, along with a lot of Germans who were about as frightened as we were.
The first shot landed 300 yards from the target. After that, the shells dropped just where they were needed. There won't be much more trouble from the German guns on Alderney.
By 1944, the Allies had the upper hand, but life in Alderney got tougher. Towards the end of the war, the island was completely cut off from France and from the other islands. An orchard and limited supplies from Alderney's one remaining farmer, Frank Osselton, barely kept even the Germans alive. And of course, when liberation finally came, it was a week later than the rest of the islands. Islanders rarely mark Alderney's Liberation Day. Instead, they commemorate the homecoming in December, when the island was repopulated back in 1945. But for those that were there, liberation meant freedom and, more importantly, food.
I can remember being fascinated by these ducks that came out of the water. To see a vehicle that could go on the water and then come up the road as well. We were allowed to go part of the way down the road. By that time, the Germans were maintaining a very low profile. I think that's a polite way of describing it. So my mother and Granny and father took us and we saw them coming up the road. And then, of course, we saw English food. And I said to my mother, because the nearest Tommy gave us some food, and I said, I've just eaten 2 slices of delicious cake. Now I know what cake's like. I've read about it in books. And she looked at my father, and then she looked at me and she said, that's not cake, you've eaten 2 slices of bread. And I'd never seen white bread.
Alderney's freedom wasn't truly realised until almost 1946, when evacuees like Buster Hammond returned to repair the damage which was done by the Germans.
It wasn't too badly changed, except for the fact of all the bunkers. That was the main thing. Everywhere you went, there were bunkers. You'd walk, and just by the side of the road, there'd be another bunker.
It would take many months for mines to be cleared, barbed wire torn down, and for the realisation to sink in that Alderney had housed the only Nazi death camp to be built on British soil. And what of the Pope family? Literature describes George Pope as a mysterious figure, and sometimes even a spy. The truth is not as glamorous. The family had arrived from England in 1939, escaping the troubles of war and aiming for New Zealand.
Of course, we believed Chamberlain. I know we were daft. So off we went in 1939, and by that time my mother had decided to go with us. And that made a delay. Result, we got across to Cherbourg and the war started. Peace in our time had gone for a burden.
So by 1946, freedom meant a chance to return to England. By now, there were 6 children and even more memories to forget. But some things are better left unsaid. Better to appreciate Alderney's liberation and remember its many dead. The rest is history, and in this instance, my family's history.